Hello Fanatics, welcome to Diamond Painting Fanatics. I am Cindy and today we are doing a true crime episode. I would like to start by saying that viewer discretion is advised. Yeah, because this actually happened. Okay, so you should know by now how all this works. So I was researching for something else and I came across this name. I would just like to give a shout out to WTFRU Reading, a subscriber of mine, left me a comment to go to other countries. So in episode 17 we went to the Czech Republic, and in this episode we're going to Germany. So I am one to take my subscriber comments on board, and yeah, so we're going to Germany. Frederick Henrik Karl Harman is known as Fritz. He is a German serial killer known as the Butcher of Hanover. So we are going way back to the 1900 era. So Fritz was born in Hanover on the 25th of October in 1879. He is the youngest. He was the sixth child and the youngest, born to Joanna and Ollie. He was a quiet child with few friends his own age or sex, and who seldom socialised, there we go, it's going to be a long one, with any children other than his siblings outside of school. Fritz's behaviour was quite noticeably feminine. He was known to shun boys' activities and instead play with his sister's dolls and dress in their clothes. He also developed a passion for both needlework and cookery, and would develop a close relationship with his mother, who spoiled her youngest child. And Fred West was his mother's favourite, and look how that turned out. Yeah. Reportedly, Fritz's father married his mother when she was 41 and 7 years his senior. Due to her wealth and substantial dowry, their marriage would eventually bring him. Dad was known to be argumentative, short-tempered, had several affairs that he conducted throughout his marriage. He contracted syphilis in his later years, despite being an authoritarian, a bossy boots, who had little time for his children and a notorious womanizer. Fritz's parents remained together until his mother's death in April 1901. Now, I don't know how I feel about that, because I'm single, and if he was off having affairs and didn't have time for children, yeah, he'd be out the door. But this isn't about me. In 1886, Fritz began his schooling, where he was noted by teachers to be spoiled and mollycoddled. He was prone to daydreaming. Although his behaviour at school was noted to be exemplary, his academic performance was below average, and Fritz had to repeat a school year twice. On one occasion, when he was about 8 years old, Fritz was molested by one of his teachers, although he never discussed this in detail. So that's sad. Fritz grew into a trim, physically strong youth. With his parents' consent, he finished his schooling in 1894. Upon leaving school, he briefly obtained employment as an apprentice locksmith before opting at the age of 15 to enroll in a military academy, and that began on the 4th of April 1895. So Fritz initially adapted to military life and performed well as a trainee soldier. However, after 5 months of military service, he began to suffer periodic lapses of consciousness. Although initially described by a medical professional as being sudden signs of anxiety, he would later it would subsequently be diagnosed as what we now know as epilepsy. And that happened in 1895. The following month, Fritz discharged himself from the military and returned to Hanover, where he briefly worked in a cigar factory that Daddy had established in 1888. Well, it wasn't a complete waste of space, although I think Mummy may have paid for them. At the age of 16, Fritz committed his first known sexual offences, all of which involved young boys whom he would lure into secluded areas, typically cellars, before proceeding to sexually abuse them. He was first arrested for committing offences of this nature in July 1896. Following further offences of this nature, the Division for Criminal Matters opted to place Fritz in a mental institution in February 1897. Although briefly transferred to a Hanover hospital for psychiatric evaluation, he would be certified as being incurably deranged and unfit to stand trial by a psychologist named Gert. Gert ordered Fritz to be confined at the mental institution indefinitely. Fritz was returned to the mental institution on the 28th of May, 1897. 7 months later, Fritz escaped the mental institution with apparent assistance from Mummy. He fled to Zurich in Switzerland, and he lived there with a relative of his mother and obtained employment as a handyman in a shipyard. He remained in Zurich for 16 months before he returned to Hanover in 1899. Early the following year, he became engaged to a woman named Erna. I think that's how you say it. Who soon became pregnant with his child. In October 1900, Fritz received notification to perform his compulsory military service. So he's going back into the army. On the 12th of October in 1900, Fitz was deployed to serve in the number 10 Rifle Battalion. Throughout his service, he earned a reputation among his superiors as an exemplary soldier with an excellent marksman. He would later describe his period of service with this battalion as being one of the happiest of his entire life. After collapsing while on exercise with the battalion in October 1901, Fitz began to suffer dizzy spells and was subsequently hospitalised for over 4 months. He was later deemed unsuitable for military service and work and was dismissed from the military service on the 28th of July 1902. Discharged from the military under medical terms, described as being probable early dementia. Fitz was awarded a monthly military pension of 21 gold marks. I don't know what the equivalent of that is today, but upon his military discharge, Fitz returned to live with his fiancée in Hanover, briefly working in the small business his father had established, before unsuccessfully filing a maintenance lawsuit against his dad, citing that he was unable to work due to the ailments noted by the military. His dad successfully contested his suit and the charges were dropped. The following year, a violent fight between father and son resulted in Dad himself unsuccessfully initiating legal proceedings against his son, citing verbal death threats and blackmail as justification to have his son returned to a mental institution. These charges were dropped due to a lack of evidence, basically. Nonetheless, Fitz was ordered to undertake a psychiatric examination in May 1903. And the psychiatrist concluded that although morally inferior, he was not mentally unstable. Now, bearing in mind, a couple of years ago, a different psychiatrist, deemed him incurably deranged. Right, so his criminal career. There's quite a lot of victims, so I'm just going to use first names, and I think a couple of names are repeated, but they are different people, so it will, you'll follow, I'm sure. For the next decade, Fritz primarily lived as a petty thief, burglar, and con artist. Although he did occasionally obtain legitimate employment, he invariably stole from his employers, and their customers. Beginning in 1905, he served several short prison sentences for offences such as larceny, embezzlement, and assault. Got to throw the assault in. But okay. On one occasion, when working legitimately as a invoice clerk, Fritz became acquainted with a female employee with whom he later claimed to have robbed several tombstones and graves between 1905 and 1913. Consequently, Harmon spent the majority of the years between 1905 and 1912 in jail, but he was never actually charged with robbing the grave sites. In late 1913, Fitz, they use surnames, Fitz was arrested for burglary A search of his home revealed a hoard of stolen property linking him to several other burglaries. Despite protesting his innocence, I mean, talk about caught red-handed, but he's like, oh, it wasn't me. He was charged with and convicted of a series of burglaries and frauds. He was sentenced to 5 years for these offences. Due to compulsory conscription resulting from the outbreak in World War I, Germany saw a shortage of available domestic manpower. In the final years of his prison sentence, he was permitted to work throughout the day in the grounds of various manor houses. This guy has been known to steal things, and they're going, oh yeah, you can go around to that manor house. I mean, really? With instructions to return to prison each evening, which he did. He complied with that. I thought he was going to run off, but he didn't. Upon his release from prison in April 1918, Fritz moved to Berlin before opting to return to Hanover, where he briefly lived with one of his sisters before renting a single-room apartment in late August 1918. According to Fritz himself, he was struck by the poverty of the German nation as a result of the loss the nation had suffered in World War I. Through his initial efforts to both trade and purchase stolen property at Hanover Central Station, he established several criminal contacts with whom he would trade in contraband property and immediately reverted to the criminal life he had lived before his 1913 arrest. Despite police knowledge that Fritz was both a known criminal and a known homosexual, which in these days was illegal and you get sent to prison for being a homosexual, which is all wrong, but that's how it was. He gradually began to establish a relationship with Hanover police as, an informer. Largely as a means of redirecting the attention of the police from himself, from his own criminal activities, which is about to get a whole lot worse, and to facilitate his access to young males. By 1919, he is known to have regularly patrolled Hanover Station and to have provided police with information relating to Hanover's extensive criminal network. With the cooperation of several police officials, Fritz devised a ruse where he would offer to fence or store stolen property at his premises, then pass this information on to the police, who would then raid his property at agreed times and arrest these contacts. To remove any suspicion as to the treachery reaching the criminal family, Fritz himself would be arrested in the raids. On numerous occasions, he is known to have performed citizens' arrests upon commuters for offences such as travelling on forged documents. As a result of these activities, police began to rely on Fritz as a reliable source of information regarding various criminal activities in the city, and he was allowed to patrol Hanover Station largely at will. I mean, that's his dream come true. Okay, so here we go. In 1918, between 1918 and 1924, Fritz committed at least 24 murders, although he is suspected of murdering a minimum of 27. All his victims were males between the ages of 10 and 22, the majority of whom were in their mid to late teens. The victims were lured back to one of 3 addresses in which Fritz is known to have resided throughout those years. He is known to have killed upon the promise of assistance, accommodation, work, or under the pretense of arrest. At Fritz's apartment, the victim was typically given food and drink before he bit into his Adam's apple, often as he was strangled. Often this caused the victim to die of asphyxiation, but on several occasions, he bit completely through his victim's Adam's apple and windpipe. Fritz referred to the act of biting through his victim's neck as his, quote, love bite. All of Fritz's known victims were dismembered before their bodies were discarded, usually in the Lean River. I'm probably getting that wrong. Although the dismembered body of his first known victim had simply been buried, and the body of his last victim had been thrown into a lake located at the entrance to the Herrenhausen Gardens. Fritz typically kept his victims' personal possessions for himself or for his lover, Hans. Or they were sold on the black market through criminal contacts both men had established at Hanover Central Station. However, the personal possessions of some of the victims were sold to legitimate retailers. In several instances, both Fritz and Hans gave possessions belonging to various victims to acquaintances as gifts. Following Fritz's arrest, rumours circulated that that Fritz had ate the flesh of his victims or sold it on the black market as pork or horse meat. Although no evidence was ever produced to confirm these theories, Franz was known to be an active trader in contraband meat, which invariably was boneless, diced, and often sold as ground meat. When asked where he obtained the meat, Fritz sometimes said he had gotten it from a butcher named Karl. Fritz initially resided in a hotel before he and Hans lodged with a middle-class family. Fritz's first known victim was 17-year-old runaway named Friedel. When Friedel disappeared on the 25th of September 1918, his friends told police he was last seen with Fritz, who at the time of his first known murder resided in a single room. Under pressure from Friedel's family, police raided Fritz's apartment in October 1918, where they found their informer in the company of a semi-naked 13-year-old boy. He was charged with both the sexual assault and battery of a minor and sentenced to 9 months imprisonment. Fritz later said to detectives that when they searched his apartment on this occasion, the head of Friedel was wrapped in newspaper and was put behind his stove. Now, if they'd have found that, they could have saved 26 more victims. But they didn't. Fritz avoided serving his sentence throughout 1919. That October, avoided serving his sentence. That October, he met 18-year-old Hans, who we've already mentioned. He had run away from his home in Berlin following an argument with his father on the 1st of October. Hans had slept rough in and around Hanover station for approximately 2 weeks, selling old clothes in and around the station to earn enough money to simply eat before he encountered Fritz. In his subsequent confessions to police, Hans stated that although his sexual orientation was heterosexual, he himself initiated contact with Fritz with the intention of selling his body, having heard of Fritz's homosexuality through acquaintances he had established in Hanover. Fritz himself stated following his arrest that he viewed Hans as being, quote, like a son to him, adding that he, quote, pulled him out of the ditch and tried to make sure he didn't go to the dogs, end quote. Shortly after their initial acquaintance, Fritz invited Hans to move into his apartment, and Hans became Fritz's lover and criminal accomplice. According to Fritz, although he was smitten with Hans, he gradually became aware that Hans was manipulating him and occasionally mocked him. And a few times he kicked Hans out after a heated argument, only for Fritz then to plead with him to come back. So despite the manipulation that Fritz endured at the hands of have I got that right? Despite the manipulation that Fritz endured at the hands of Hans, he later claimed to tolerate all of that because he craved companionship and affection. Adding, quote, I have to have someone I meant everything to, end quote. Fritz served the 9-month prison sentence imposed in 1918 for sexual assault and battery between March and December 1920. Upon his release, he again regained the trust of the police and again became an informer. Fritz initially resided in a hotel before he and Hans lodged with a middle-class family. Through criminal contacts, Fritz became aware of a vacant ground floor apartment. The apartment was located in a densely populated old house alongside the Lean River. Fritz secured a letting agreement with the landlady, and I think it included some storage with that. So he and Hans moved into this apartment together on the 1st of July 1921. Fritz's victims largely consisted of young male commuters, runaways, and occasionally male prostitutes, whom he would typically encounter in or around Hanover's central railway station. The second murder that Franz is known to have committed occurred on the 12th of February 1923. The victim was 17-year-old. His name is also Fritz, so for the sake of this, we will call him Frank, which is his surname. So 17-year-old Frank, whom Fritz encountered at Hanover Central Station and invited to his apartment, where he introduced the young lad to Hans, who had two female acquaintances with him, one of whom was Hans' female lover. Okay. According to that girlfriend, that evening, Hans had whispered in her ear, "Hey, he's going to get trampled on today," end quote. The following day, both these acquaintances returned to Fritz's apartment, where they were informed by Fritz that Frank had travelled to Hamburg. Speculation remains as to Hans' knowledge of Fritz's intentions towards Frank when he made the comment to the two female acquaintances. According to Fritz, following this murder, Hans arrived unannounced at his apartment, where he observed Frank's nude body lying upon on Fritz's bed. Hans then simply looked at him and asked, "When shall I come back?" Wow. 5 weeks after the murder of Frank, on the 20th of March, Fritz encountered 17-year-old Will at Hanover Station. Will had been travelling to work when he encountered Fritz. No human remains identified as belonging to Will were ever found, although most of his clothing was in the possession of Fritz's landlady, Elizabeth, that's her name, at the time of his arrest. 2 more victims are known to have been murdered at this same apartment. Before he vacated the apartment in June. So 16-year-old Roland, who disappeared on the 23rd of May after informing a close friend he intended to run away from home and join the Marines. 19-year-old Hans, who disappeared in or around the 31st of May, whose distinctive yellow overcoat Fritz is known to have worn after the youth's murder. I mean, really? On the 9th of June 1923, Fritz moved into another single-room attic apartment. 2 weeks after moving into this address, he chose to turn his life around. No, he didn't. Okay, so 2 weeks after moving into this address on the 25th of June, Ernest, a 13-year-old son of Fritz's neighbour, disappeared running an errand for his dad. His school cap and braces would be found in Fritz's apartment following his arrest. 2 months later, on the 24th of August, an 18-year-old office clerk named Henrik was reported missing by his aunt, who he lived with. Many of Henrik's belongings would also be found in his apartment. And then his murder would be followed 1 month later by the murder of 17-year-old Paul, who disappeared en route to the city. Having worked with his uncle throughout the summer. Subsequent police inquiry suggested that Paul had likely alighted the train at Hanover, where he evidently encountered Fritz. Paul's jacket, knapsack, trousers and towel would all be found in the possession of Fritz following his arrest. Oh dear. Fritz is known to have killed on or around the 30th of September 1923, 17-year-old Richard, who last informed his family he had met an individual at Hanover station who, quote, knows of a good job for me. 2 weeks later, on the 12th of October, a 16-year-old youth named there's another Will, so Will 2, failed to return home from work. Subsequent inquiries by Will 2's parents revealed revealed the youth became acquainted with a detective, Fritz Honnerbrock. It's a pseudonym for Fritz. Shortly before his disappearance, both Fritz and Hans subsequently sold Will 2's bicycle on the 20th of October. Within a week of having sold this bicycle, Fritz killed 2 further victims. 15-year-old Herman, who disappeared from Hanover station on the 24th of October, and 13-year-old Heinz, who was last seen by a witness standing in the entrance to Hanover station at 11 p.m. on the 27th of October, having missed his train home. On the 10th of October 1923, a 17-year-old apprentice carpenter named Adolf disappeared from Hanover station. He was seen by several witnesses sitting upon a trunk in the waiting room. These witnesses also positively identified Hans in the company of Fritz, pointing towards the youth, who shortly thereafter was observed walking towards a cafe in the company of them two. 1 month later, on the 6th of December, 19-year-old Adolf II disappeared. He had been seeking employment at the time of his disappearance. None of the human remains recovered were identified as belonging to Adolf II, who Fritz specifically admitted to dismembering but denied killing. Yeah, that'll work. In subsequent court testimony, which was absolutely disputed by Hans, Fritz claimed he returned home to find Adolf II's body, missing his signature love bite, laying naked on his bed with Hans and another criminal acquaintance named Hugo, stating the youth was, quote, one of yours. Neither Fritz or Hans were convicted of Adolf II's murder due to the conflicting testimony. Now we're in 1924. The first victim killed by Fritz in 1924 was 17-year-old Ernst, who disappeared on the 5th of January. Although subsequent trial testimony from a friend of Ernst indicated Fritz had become acquainted with this youth before his murder. Fritz stated that he would simply have to, quote, assume this youth was one of his victims due to all his personal possessions being found in his or Hans' possession following his arrest. 10 days later, Fritz killed 20-year-old Henry, whom he believed to have been acquainted with prior to the youth's murder. The following month, Fritz is known to have killed 2 further victims. 19-year-old Willie, who disappeared from the suburbs of Linden-Lima on the 2nd of February, having informed his sister he was to travel with a friend. And 16-year-old Herman, too, was last seen by his sister on the 8th of February. Fritz is not known to have killed again until about the 1st of April, when he is believed to have killed an acquaintance, also named Herman. So is that Herman 3 now? Although cleared of this murder at trial, Fritz was in possession of Herman's clothing when arrested, and he is known to have given the youth's suitcase to his landlady. Fritz is known to have actively dissuaded several of Herman's acquaintances from reporting the youth missing. 1 week later, on the 8th of April, 16-year-old Alfred disappeared from Hanover station, having run away from home. Alfred's murder would be followed 9 days later by that of a 16-year-old apprentice named Will 2. Even I'm getting confused now. Who Fritz encountered on his, quote, patrols of Hanover station. On the 26th of April, 18-year-old Robert disappeared after borrowing, I don't know what this is, but he's borrowed a couple of quid from his mum, explaining that he intended to visit a travelling circus. Inquiries by Robert's parents revealed that their son had accompanied, quote, an official from the railway station, end quote, to the circus. Fritz himself would later state that he killed Robert the same evening, and having dismembered the youth's body, had thrown the lakes into the Lean River. God, he's so busy, this guy. He's not like... It's madness. Even I'm shocked. And 2 weeks later, after the murder of Robert, Fritz killed 14-year-old Heinz II, who was last seen by his mother on the 9th of May, and who is believed to have been abducted from Hanover station. All his clothing was later found in Fritz's apartment. Less than 3 weeks later, on the 26th of May, a 17-year-old travelling salesman named Fritz, I can't even pronounce his surname, so it's another Fritz, whom murderous Fritz would later state he killed upon the insistence of Hans, as he had worn a, quote, good new suit. Hans I'm not sure what that says. But he was dismembered and discarded in the Lean River. The same day, that innocent Fritz was murdered. Murderous Fritz killed his youngest known victim, 10-year-old Frederick, who disappeared while truanting from school. His murder would be followed less than 2 weeks later by that of 16-year-old Frederick II, who was approached by Fritz on the 5th of June as he walked to college. Two acquaintances... sorry, I'm a bit stuck on that 10-year-old, if he'd have just gone to school. Oh dear. 16-year-old Frederick. So we have two Fredericks, the 10-year-old and the 16-year-old. The 16-year-old was approached by Fritz on the 5th of June as he walked to college. Sorry, I said that already. Oh, that threw me. Two acquaintances of the 16-year-old Frederick would later testify at Fritz's trial as they walked with him to college. Fritz approached Frederick and tapped the youth on the boot with his walking stick and stated, quote, "Well, boy, don't you recognise me?" Wow, that's brave. Fritz killed his final victim, 17-year-old Eric, on the 14th of June 1924. Eric encountered Fritz at Hanover station. His dismembered body would later be found in a lake at the gardens that we mentioned earlier. Fritz would confess it had taken him 4 separate trips to carry his dismembered remains, carried in the leather bag in which belonged to the 16-year-old Frederick, to the location he had disposed of them. Okay, so now we're moving on to the discoveries, which is going to be quite graphic, I think. On the 17th of May 1924, 2 children were playing near the Lean River and discovered a human skull. Determined to be that of a young male aged between 18 and 20 and bearing evidence of knife wounds, police were sceptical as to whether a murder had been committed or whether the skull had either been discarded in this location by grave robbers or placed there in a tasteless prank by medical students. Furthermore, the police theory was that the skull may have been discarded at the river Alfeld, which had recently experienced an outbreak of, I don't know how to pronounce that, typhoid. 2 weeks later, on the 29th of May, a second skull was found behind a mill race located close to the scene of the earlier discovery. This skull was also identified as having been that of a young male aged between 18 and 20. Shortly thereafter, 2 boys playing in a field close to the discoveries, they discovered a sack containing numerous human bones. 2 more skulls would be found on the 13th of June, one upon the banks of the Lean River, another located close to a mill in West Hanover. Each of the skulls had been removed from the spine with a sharp instrument. One skull belonged to a male in his late teens, whereas the other skull belonged to a boy estimated to have been between the ages of 11 and 13. In addition, one of these skulls also bore evidence of being scalped. I wouldn't put it past Fritz, to be honest. For more than a year prior to these discoveries, rumours had circulated in Hanover about the fate of the sheer number of children and teenagers who had been reported missing. Discoveries sparked fresh rumours regarding missing and murdered children. In addition, various newspapers responded to these discoveries and the resulting rumours by harking to the disproportionate number of young people who had been reported missing in Hanover between 1918 and 1924. On the 8th of June, several hundred Hanover residents converged close to the Lean River and searched both the banks of the river and the surrounding areas, discovering a number of human bones, which were handed to the police. In response to these latest discoveries, police decided to drag the entire section of the river which ran through the centre of the city. In doing so, they discovered more than 500 further human bones and sections of bodies, many bearing knife wounds, scratch marks, I can't pronounce that word, which were later confirmed by a court doctor as having belonged to at least 22 separate human individuals. Approximately half the remains had been in the river for some time, whereas other bones and body parts had been discarded in the river more recently. So you have to remember they haven't got this, like now you have specialists in that can tell you how long the flies have been on the body and how long they can date the body. They haven't got any of that here. Many of the recent and aged discoveries bore evidence of having been dissected, particularly at the joints. Over 30% of the remains were judged to have belonged to young males aged between 15 and 20. Suspicion for the discoveries quickly fell upon Fritz, who is known to both the police and the Criminal Investigation Department as a homosexual who had amassed 15 prior convictions dating from 1896 for various offences, including child molestation and the sexual assault and battery of a minor. Fritz had been connected to the 1918 disappearance of Friedel and the 14-year-old Herman, who had disappeared just weeks before Friedel had. Fritz was placed under surveillance. Being a trusted police informant, Fritz was known to frequent Hanover Central Station, as well as he was well known to many officers from Hanover. 2 young policemen were drafted from Berlin to pose as undercover officers and discreetly observe his movements. The surveillance of Fritz began on the 18th of June 1924. Good. On the night of the 22nd of June, Fritz was observed by the 2 undercover officers prowling Hanover Central Station. He was soon observed arguing with a 15-year-old boy named Carl. Then to approach police and assist, they arrested the youth on the charge of travelling upon forged documents. Upon his arrest, Carl informed police that he had been living with Fritz for 4 days and that he had been repeatedly raped by his accuser. Sometimes a knife was held to his throat. Fritz was arrested the following morning and charged with sexual assault. Oh my God. Following his arrest, Fritz's attic apartment was searched. Fritz had lived in this single-room apartment since June 1923. The flooring, the walls, and bedding within the apartment were found to be extensively blood-stained. Ooh, and he's sleeping in that? Oh. Fritz initially attempted to explain this fact as a byproduct of his illegal trading in contraband meat. Various acquaintances and former neighbours of Fritz were also extensively questioned as to his activities. Many fellow tenants and neighbours of the various addresses in which Fritz lived since 1920 commented to detectives about the number of teenage boys they observed visiting his various addresses. Some had seen him leaving his property with concealed sacks, bags or baskets in the late evening or early morning hours. 2 former tenants informed police that in the spring of 1924 they had discreetly followed Fritz from his apartment and observed him discarding a heavy sack into the Lean River. Which begs the question. I mean, I know why didn't they go to the police and say, look, this is a bit suspicious. Like, can you just keep an eye on that? Why didn't they do that? I know you can't really go, oh, well, you know, it might have been, it could be anything he was throwing in there, I know, but it's still suspicious activity. Anyway, the clothes and personal possessions found at Fritz's apartment and in the possession of his acquaintances were suspected as being the property of missing youths. All were confiscated and put on display at Hanover station, with the parents of missing teenage boys from across Germany invited to look at the items. As successive days passed, an increasing number of items were identified by family members as having belonged to their sons or brothers. Fritz did initially attempt to dismiss these successive revelations as being circumstantial in nature by explaining he acquired many of these items through his business of trading in used clothing, with other items being left at his apartment by youths who he engaged in sexual activity. The turning point came on the 29th of June. Clothes, boots and keys found stowed at Fritz's apartment were identified as belonging to a missing 18-year-old Robert. A skull which had been found in a garden on the 20th of May, which was not initially connected with the other skeletal discoveries, was identified as that of Robert. A friend of Robert identified a police officer seen in the company of the youth that the day prior to his disappearance as Fritz. Confronted with this evidence, Fritz briefly attempted to bluster his way out of these latest and most damning pieces of evidence. When Robert's jacket was found in the possession of his landlady and he was confronted with the various witness testimonies as to his destroying identification marks upon the clothing, he broke down and had to be supported by his sister. Faced with this latest evidence and upon the urging of his sister, Fritz confessed to raping, killing, and dismembering many young men in what he initially described as a, quote, rabid sexual passion, end quote, between 1918 and 1924. According to Fritz, he never actually intended to murder any of his victims, but he would be seized by an irresistible urge to bite into or through their Adam's apple, often as he manually strangled them in the throes of ecstasy. Really? Before typically collapsing atop the victim's body. Only one intended victim had escaped from Fritz's apartment after he attempted to bite into his Adam's apple, although this individual is not known to have reported the attack to the police. All of Fritz's victims' bodies were disposed of via dismemberment shortly after their murder, and Fritz was insistent that he found the act of dismemberment extremely unpleasant. It was so unpleasant he done it a further 27 times. He stated he had been ill for 8 days after his first murder. Nonetheless, Fritz was insistent that his passion at the moment of murder was invariably, quote, stronger than the horror of the cutting and the chopping, end quote, which would inevitably follow, and he would typically take up to 2 days to complete. To fortify himself to dismember his victims' bodies, Fritz would pour himself a cup of strong black coffee, then place the body of his victim upon the floor of his apartment and cover the face with a cloth, before first removing the intestines, which he would place inside a bucket. A towel would then be repeatedly placed inside the abdominal cavity to soak the collecting blood. He would then make 3 cuts between the victim's ribs and shoulders. Then, quote, oh, this is going to be bad. Take hold of the ribs and push until the bones around the shoulders broke, end quote. The victim's heart, lungs, and kidneys would then be removed, diced, and placed in the same bucket which held the intestines, before the legs and arms would be severed from the body. Fritz would then begin what's this word? I'm assuming taking off the flesh from the limbs and torso. This surplus flesh would be disposed of in the toilet or usually in the nearby river. Dearie me, I did say it was going to be graphic. Didn't realise it was going to be that graphic, but the final section of the victims' bodies to be dismembered was invariably the head. After severing the head from the torso, Fritz would use a small kitchen knife to strip all the flesh from the skull, which he would then wrap in rags and place face downward upon a pile of straw and bludgeon with an axe until the skull splintered, enabling him to access the brain. This he would also place in a bucket, which he would pour alongside the, quote, chopped up bones in the river. Oh dear. Fritz was insistent that none of the skulls found in the river belonged to his victims, and that the forensic identification of the skull of Robert was mistaken, as he had almost invariably smashed his victims' skulls to pieces, with the exceptions of those of his earliest victims, killed several years prior to his arrest, and that of his last victim, Eric. Although insistent that none of his murders were premeditated, investigators discovered much circumstantial evidence suggesting that several murders had been planned hours or days in advance, and that Fritz had both concocted explanations for his victims' disappearances and dissuaded acquaintances of his victims from filing missing persons reports with Hanover police. Investigators also noted that Fritz would only confess to murders for which there existed evidence against him. On one occasion, Fritz stated, "There are some victims you don't know about, but it's not those that you think." When asked how many victims he killed, Fritz claimed somewhere between 50 and 70. The police, however, could only connect Fritz to the disappearance of 27 youths and was charged with 27 murders, some of which he claimed were committed upon the insistence of Hans, who was arrested on the 8th of July and formally charged with being an accessory to murder 1 week later. On the 16th of August 1924, Fritz underwent a psychological examination and was judged competent to stand trial and returned to Hanover to await trial. Now, I'm feeling queasy, I don't know about you, but he's claimed that there's between 50 and 70. So he did do them, the ones that they found. He's done them without doubt. But if he then began crushing their skulls, they're not going to find them, are they? Oh, dearie me. Trial. Oh. The trial of Fritz and Hans began on the 4th of December 1924. Fritz was charged with the murder of 27 boys and young men who had disappeared between September 1918 and June 1924. In 14 of these cases, Fritz, who insisted upon conducting his own defence, acknowledged his guilt, although he claimed to be uncertain of the identification of the remaining 13 victims upon the list of charges. Hans pleaded not guilty to charges of being an accessory to murder in several of the murders. Initially, following through a security search, all members of the public were permitted access to the courtroom, although by the third day, the judge excluded all spectators from the courtroom in the opening days of the trial, as each murder was discussed in detail. Due to the ongoing carnal and gruesome nature of the revelations. The trial was one of the first major modern media events in Germany and received extensive international press coverage, being described as the most revolting case in German criminal history, verifying sensational headlines in which Fritz was variously referred to by such titles as the Butcher of Hanover, the Vampire of Hanover, and the Wolfman. They continuously appeared in the press. Although Fritz denied any premeditation in the crimes, come on, and remained adamant the ultimate reason he killed was a mystery to him. He readily confessed to having killed 14 of the victims, for whose murder he was tried, and retaining and selling many of their possessions, although he denied having sold the body parts of any of his victims as contraband meat. Fritz's denial that he had either consumed or sold human flesh would be supported by a medical expert who testified on the 6th of December that none of the meat found in Fritz's apartment following his arrest was human. When asked to identify photographs of his victims, Fritz became dismissive, as he typically claimed to be unable to recognize any of his victims' photographs. However, in instances where he claimed to be unable to recognize his victims' faces, but the victims' clothing or personal belongings had been found in his possession, he would simply shrug and make comments to the effect of, "I probably killed him," or "Charge it to me, it's all right with me." For example, when asked to identify a photograph of Alfred, Fritz stated, "I certainly assume I killed Alfred, but I don't remember his face." Numerous exhibits were introduced into evidence in the opening days of the trial, including 285 sections of the skeletal structure, particularly skulls and thigh bones, recovered from the river and forensically determined as belonging to young men under 20 years of age, which had been retrieved from the Lean River. The bucket to which he stored and transported human remains, and the extensively blood-stained camp bed upon which he had killed many of his victims. As had been the case when earlier asked whether he could recognize the photographs of any of his victims, Fritz's demeanour became dismissive upon the introduction of these exhibits. He denied any of the skulls introduced into evidence belonging to his victims, stating he had almost invariably mashed the victims' skulls and had thrown only one undamaged skull into the river. Several acquaintances and criminal associates of Fritz testified for the prosecution, including former neighbours who had testified to having purchased ground meat or mince from Frederick, whom they noted regularly left to his apartment with packages of meat, but rarely arrived with them. Oh my God. Fritz's landlady, Elizabeth, testified that Fritz would regularly pour chopped pieces of meat into boiling water and would strain fat from the meat that Fritz claimed was pork. This fat would invariably be poured into bottles. Oh my God. If he really did do this, it brings a whole new level on one occasion on April the 24th. Oh my goodness. Even I'm beginning to struggle here. Fritz's landlady and her family became ill after eating sausages in skins. Fritz claimed they were sheep's intestine. Another neighbour testified to the alarming number of youths whom he had seen entering Fritz's apartment, but whom he seldom observed leaving the address. This neighbour assumed Fritz was selling youths to the Foreign Legion. Another neighbour testified to having observed Fritz throw a sack of bones into the river. Two female acquaintances, do you remember them from way back when? They testified how on one occasion in 1923 they discovered what they believed to be a human mouth boiling in a soup kettle in Fritz's apartment. These witnesses testified that they had taken the item to Hanover police, who simply replied, "The piece of flesh may be a pig's snout." By the second week of the trial, testimony was introduced about how much the police knew about Fritz's criminal activities after his 1918 release from prison. The police apparently never suspected him for any of the cases of the missing boys and young men in Hanover in 1923 and 1924, even though some of the victims were last seen in his company and he had a long criminal record that included charges of sexual assault and battery. Does raise the question, was he more valuable as an informant? So we'll turn a blind eye. But they wouldn't, surely they wouldn't. Not of something of this magnitude. Oh. Conviction. The trial lasted barely 2 weeks, and a total of 190 witnesses testified. On the 19th of December 1924, the court reconvened to impose a sentence upon both defendants. Judged sane and accountable for his actions, Fritz was found guilty of 24 of the 27 murders and sentenced to death by beheading. He was acquitted of 3 murders which he denied committing. Upon hearing the sentence, Fritz stood before the court and proclaimed, "I accept the verdict fully and freely. I shall go to the decapitating block joyfully and happily." End quote. Hans became hysterical upon hearing he had been found guilty of incitement to murder and sentenced to death by beheading in relation to the murder of Adolf, with an additional sentence of 12 years imprisonment imposed for being an accessory to murder in the case of Fritz. Innocent Fritz, just in case. Upon returning to his cell after hearing the verdict, Hans collapsed. In the case of Adolf, several witnesses testified to having seen Hans in the company of Fritz, pointing towards the youth. Fritz claimed this was one of 2 murders committed upon the insistence of Hans, and for this reason, Hans was sentenced to death. In the case of innocent Fritz, police found a handwritten note from murderous Fritz dated the day of innocent Fritz's disappearance, signed by both him and Hans, in which Hans agreed to pay Fritz 20 gold marks for the youth's suit. As the note indicated Hans' possible knowledge in the disappearance, he was convicted of being an accomplice to murderous Fritz in this murder and sentenced to 12 years. What is this? Fritz addressing the court prior to his sentencing. This is quoted: "Condemn me to death. I ask only for justice. I'm not mad. Make it short, make it soon. Deliver me from this life, which is a torment. I will not petition for mercy, nor will I appeal. I want to pass just one more merry night in my cell with coffee, cheese and cigars, after which I will curse my father and go to my execution as if it were a wedding." Fritz made no appeal against the verdict, claiming his death would atone for his crimes and stating that were he at liberty, he would likely kill again. You think? Hans did lodge an appeal against his sentence, although his appeal was rejected on the 6th of February 1925. At 6 o'clock on the morning of the 15th of April 1925, Fritz Hamann was beheaded by guillotine in the grounds of Hanover prison. His executioner was Karl Gropler. In accordance with German tradition, Fritz was not informed of his execution date until the prior evening. Upon receipt of the news, he observed prayer with his pastor before being granted his final wishes of an expensive cigar to smoke and Brazilian coffee to drink in his cell. No members of the press were permitted to witness the execution, and the event was seen by only a handful of witnesses. Well, I would hope if they wanted to go, the family of the victims would be there. According to published reports, although Fritz was pale and nervous, he maintained a sense of bravado as he walked to the guillotine. The last words Fritz spoke were, quote, "I am guilty, gentlemen, but hard though it may be, I want to die as a man," end quote. Immediately prior to placing his head upon the execution apparatus, Fritz added, "I repent, but I do not fear death." The true tally of Fritz's victims will never be known. Following his arrest, Fritz made several imprecise statements regarding both the actual number of his victims he killed and when he began killing. Initially, Fritz claimed to have killed maybe 30, maybe 40 victims. Later, he would claim the true number of victims he had killed was between 50 and 70. So there's a list here of victims. So he wasn't charged. Conviction, not charged, yes, not charged, yes, 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 yes. There's a no, then a yes, 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 no, yes, 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 yeah, so okay, so Fritz was acquitted of 3 murders at his trial. those of Adolf II, Herman, and Herman. In each instance, strong circumstantial evidence existed attesting to his guilt. In the case of Herman, I'm not sure which one, police established that prior to the youth's disappearance, he had informed his father he had conversed with a detective at Hanover station. Fritz is known to have given many of the victim's clothes to his landlady in the days immediately following his 44th birthday. The youth's distinctive belt buckle was found at Fritz's address. Fritz only chose to deny this murder midway through the trial, following heated threats made against him by the father of the murdered youth. Okay. I'm surely that would have been obvious to them. Fritz was acquitted of the murder of Adolf II, due to conflicting testimony regarding the circumstances as to whether he or Hans actually murdered him. Although Fritz admitted at trial to having dismembered his body, he claimed to have returned to the apartment and found a dead body laying there, to which he claimed Hans simply replied, "One of yours." Hans would deny this claim and would state that he had bought Adolf II's distinctive coat from Fritz for 8 marks. After having been warned the coat was stolen. Due to this conflicting testimony and the lack of an actual witness to the murder, that neither of them were convicted on that murder. In the case of Herman too, several friends had testified at Fritz's trial prior to his arrest. They were actively dissuaded from filing a missing person report upon the youth with police. These witnesses testified that Fritz was insistent on filing the report himself. He never did. Other witnesses testified to having acquired various personal possessions belonging to the youth from Fritz. In addition, a tailor testified that at Fritz's trial to having been asked by Fritz to alter the suit. Fritz repeatedly contradicted himself regarding his claims as to how he acquired the possessions. It is likely that Fritz chose to deny this murder due to evidence suggesting the murder had been premeditated as opposed to being committed in the throes of passion. He had known the youth for several years prior to the murder and was known to be heterosexual. The victim was heterosexual. Due to his denial of having committed this particular murder, he was acquitted. We also have other suspected victims. So he is believed to have killed 14-year-old another Herman who disappeared just weeks prior to his first confirmed victim, Friedel. Hans, and again innocent Hans, was strongly suspected. He was 17 and was reported missing on the 17th of March 1922, whose nude-bound body was found in a canal on the 6th of May. The cause of death was strangulation, and the body had no signs of mutilation. The distinctive handkerchief bearing Hans' name was found lodged in his throat. Okay, but There's no mutilation, which is what he's known for. Nude-bound body in a canal, none of it fits, and it's 1922, so he's got his MO down to pat by then. So, I'm not sure, personally, I'm not sure if that, prior to the discovery of the body, Fritz is known to have both visited the youth's parents, offering to locate their son, and to have immediately thereafter informed the police that he believed Hans was responsible. Like, guilty Hans. Oh my God. However, Hans is known to have been in custody at the time of the disappearance. 2 weeks prior to the disappearance, Fritz had returned to his other apartment, having served 6 months in a labour camp for several acts of theft he committed in August 1921. Upon his return, Fritz discovered that Hans had stolen much of his personal property and fraudulently obtained and spent his military pension while he had been incarcerated. This resulted in a violent argument between the two men. That's why he was evicted. Shortly thereafter, Hans and a criminal acquaintance named Hugo returned and further ransacked the apartment. It's likely that Fritz committed the murder in attempt to frame Hans. Okay, that makes more sense, I guess. But he wasn't tried for the murder, either of those murders, and they both officially are unsolved. Following Fritz's execution, sections of his brain were removed for forensic analysis. An examination of slices of his brain is quite ironic, really. Revealed traces of meningitis, although no section of his brain were permanently preserved. Nonetheless, Fritz's head was preserved in formaldehyde, is that how you say it, and remained in the possession of the medical school from 1925 until 2014, when it was cremated. Wow. The remains of Fritz's victims, which had been recovered, were buried together in a communal grave in Stockener Cemetery in February 1925. In April 1928, a large granite memorial in the form of a, I can't pronounce that, triptych, inscribed with the names and ages of the victims, was erected over the communal grave. The discovery of a letter from Fritz declaring Hans innocent subsequently led to Hans receiving a second trial. This letter was dated the 5th of February 1925 and was addressed to the father of Hans. In this letter, Fritz claimed that although he had been frustrated at having been seen as little more than a, quote, meal ticket by Hans had absolutely no idea that I killed. Furthermore, Fritz claimed many of his accusations against Hans prior to his trial were obtained under extreme duress, and that he falsely accused Hans of instigating the murders of Adolf and Robert as a means of revenge. Fritz claimed that his pastor would be informed as to the contents and the authenticity of the letter. Hans was retried in January 1926. He was charged with aiding and abetting Fritz in the murders of victims Adolf II and innocent Fritz. Although Hans stated in one address to the judge at his second trial that he expected to be acquitted, on the 19th of January he was again found guilty of aiding and abetting Fritz in both cases, although in this instance he was sentenced to 2 concurrent 12-year sentences. After serving this 12-year sentence, Hans was interned to Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Following the conclusion of the Second World War, he continued to live in Hanover until his death in 1975. The murders committed by Fritz stirred much discussion in Germany regarding methods used in police investigation, the treatment of mentally ill offenders, and the validity of the death penalty. However, the most heated topic of discussion in relation to the murders committed by Fritz were issues relating to the subject of homosexuality. Really? That's what people choose to talk about? Which was then illegal and punishable by imprisonment in Germany. The discovery of the murders subsequently stirred a wave of homophobia throughout Germany, with one historian noting, quote, "It split the gay rights movement irreparably, fed every prejudice against homosexuality, and provided new fodder for conservative adversaries of legal sex reform." End quote. Wow. That is it, guys. We are at the end. What an episode. Films have been done. The most recent is a 2010 film called Cyrus, Mind of a Serial Killer, which was loosely based on both Fritz and the American serial killer Henry Lee Lucas. Wow. There you go, guys. I had no idea it was going to get that graphic. I'm at a loss, really, as to how I feel about this, because, I mean, if you go back to the beginning of the episode where Gert, the psychiatrist? He said that he was incurably deranged. He was pretty accurate. And I know he had several assessments later on which deemed him fit and, but still. If he hadn't had the help of his mother and he remained in that mental institute where he escaped from, none of this would have happened. And again, if his dad had got him, when he filed his little lawsuit, if he had successfully got him back into that mental institution, who knows what could have happened. But it's so very sad that these young, they're teenagers, aren't they? Yeah, it's so very sad and very, very sick, and I don't know if he did use their bodies to then make sausages and stuff, but it's looking likely that he did. I have to say it. From this article alone, it's certainly looking like he did. So there you go, guys. I have kind of ruined your day. Yeah, thank you for spending time with me. I really do appreciate it. I have just put a picture up of Faye as I have finished her. So if you have enjoyed spending time with me, listening to this most horrific story episode, please consider hitting that subscribe button if you haven't already subscribed. I would really appreciate it. And I shall see you with another episode very, very soon. If you have enjoyed, I don't like saying that, but if you have enjoyed this story, please can you give the video a thumbs up, just to give me an indication on how gruesome you want your true crime stories. I am gonna skedaddle, guys. I love you all. Stay safe. And I shall see you in my next episode. Bye, guys.